programs at AstroLabs. I've been with them for about 5 years, and I've been coding actually since I was only 12 years old. So I actually built my first website when I was 12. And like since then, I studied computer engineering, and I've been in the coding world. So what I'll teach you today mainly is like where the current landscape is, and also what are the different areas that you should know about if you want to get into the coding field. So this is basically a sample of our 2-month coding bootcamp, which starts at the beginning of June. So it'll be after Eid. And in this program, we basically will walk you through a 2-month program on full stack JavaScript. It's the largest coding bootcamp in the region. It's fully remote, so you can attend from the comfort of your home. It's over 100 hours of live coding. So it's a very practical program. There's not any program like it in the region because we actually make you do the coding on your own. It's not theoretical, it's very, very practical. And I'm gonna walk you through some of the technologies that we cover in the program. And like I said, it's a full stack JavaScript. And if you don't know what JavaScript is, I'll explain that in a minute. But it's a language that we use in the program, and it's open to beginners. So even if you have no coding experience at all, you're welcome to attend. It's, like I said, fully remote, and everything is online, and you get lifetime access to all of the material, all of the videos, and all of the learning. We also offer career support as well. So a lot of our graduates now work at large companies like IBM and a bunch of other startups, Zomato, and yeah, I mean, like just to name a couple. And we also help them start their own businesses. So also a couple of the people that came to our program also started their own apps and started their own companies. So we can support you if you're looking for a job and if you are looking to start off your own company. If you want to learn more, you can head to this link. And if you stay till the end, I'll share with you a special discount code on the program. Also, I'm going to share an email with you on the chat. One of our, one of my colleagues, Majd, is also on the call as well. So if any of you have a question about this program, or if you would like the slides, feel free just to send him a message and he can get back to you with the slides for today and any follow-up questions that you might have. All right, so let's get into the topic. So today we're going to talk about coding. And the first thing that you should know about coding is it's not like learning a lot of the other digital skills that you might come across. It's a very technical topic. And it's almost as if you're learning a new language. When you want to learn how to code, it's not something that can be done in a week. It takes you several months to at least get started with it. And that's why our program is a 2-month program, because learning to code is not something that you can just pick up in a few days or a few weeks. So like just keep that in mind. Have any of you heard about something called the 10,000 hour rule? Has anyone heard about that before? It's from a famous quote by Malcolm Gladwell, and it was quoted in a lot of different scientific papers. And the idea behind this hypothesis is that if you want to get really good at something, it takes you around 10,000 hours of practice. So the same is true for learning how to code. It takes you a lot of time, right? It's not something that you can just pick up on your own. You have to actually practice. Because it's a vocational skill. It's a practical skill. It's not a theoretical skill. It's one that you actually have to learn how to do it by doing. So in the class, we basically do cover some theory, but even during our program, we give you things to work on to actually have you practice. And I mean, even if you don't want to take our coding bootcamp, if you want to learn how to code, you still have to practice every day. So whenever I first started learning how to code, it took me about 2 years of basically practicing almost every single day for at least 1 hour until I became somewhat good. So like just keep that in mind as a skill. And if you want to do this professionally, it is going to take a lot of time. Now, the benefit of that is that the barrier for someone to also come in the field is a lot higher. So what that means is you'll have a lot less competition if you become very good, if you're looking for a job or like you want to become professional. That's why people that are really good coders, they make a lot of money. If they manage to like get past that barrier of not just being someone that's a beginner, but someone that is a professional coder, it's an amazing skill to have. And like as a career, it'll basically be almost impossible for you to be unemployed if you become very, very good at your job. Okay, so what I want to talk about now is one of the most common questions people have when it comes to coding is, what language should I learn? So like people often say, oh, like I want to build a mobile app, or I want to build a website, or I want to learn data science. What language should I learn? So that's not a really easy question to answer because it depends on what you want to build. And oftentimes, if you look at most companies, if they are building their software in a certain language, okay, I have a question for the audience. If a company is building their software in a certain language, what is the #1 factor that determines what language they're building in? Can anyone guess? Like, let's say that a company, company X, right, is building their software, and they chose a certain language, like let's say Java. What is the #1 factor that companies use to basically choose what language they should focus on? Can anyone guess? If you can guess, just type it in the chat. Yeah, so Elmer answered correctly. So the answer actually is, it's mainly whatever language their own team knows or their own developers know. So there's a famous saying that if the only tool that you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, right? And the idea behind this is that if you hire someone that's a developer and they know Java, they'll tell you, yeah, of course you should build it in Java. If you hire someone that knows Swift or Objective-C, he'll say, yeah, you have to do it in Swift. So I mean, like what I found is that most companies don't choose a language based on what is the best language. They mainly choose it based on what does their current team know. So having said that, there are certain trends that you can notice if you look across all of the main types of applications that people can build. And I want to ask you, can you notice from the diagram here if there's any language that you notice that's a common language? So there's a current trend that's been going around for the last like maybe 3 years, in that a lot of the languages are starting to unify around a single language. Yeah, and some of you mentioned correctly, it's actually JavaScript. So now JavaScript is currently becoming the de facto language for a lot of the applications that people are developing. And the reason is that, #1, it's really easy to get into it as a language. #2 is that it's not that strict in terms of how you can write it. So what that means is that there are lots of libraries that have propped up and like came up that basically let you do almost anything. So I'm going to talk about that in a bit, but if I want to build a mobile app, I can do it using JavaScript. If I want to build a desktop app, I can do it using JavaScript. If I want to build a website, I can do it using JavaScript. If I want to even build something that's on blockchain, I can do it using JavaScript. So now JavaScript, there's been a trend in the last maybe 3 or 4 years where JavaScript now is becoming basically the main default language. And if you look at coding websites like GitHub, where people can post their own code, for the last couple of years, JavaScript has always been #1, and it has overtaken programs like Python and Java and other languages. And it's mainly because of how versatile it is as a language. So that's mainly why we're focusing on JavaScript for our coding bootcamp, because if you like know how to code something in JavaScript, then you can basically code anything that you want. Also, keep in mind that if you learn one programming language, I mean, like, let's say now you're not a coder, you're not a developer, and you want to get into coding. It's a lot easier if you know at least one coding language for you to learn a different coding language, because a lot of the patterns that you'll see are common across all languages. So one example of this is all coding languages have things called variables. They all have things called functions, right? If you know what a variable is and you know what a function is and you know what a loop is, you can easily change and go to a different coding language. But it's still better nowadays based on the data that I've seen. I personally think that it's better to start with JavaScript first. So having said that, if you want to get started, I also recommend that you focus on web development first. And the reason is because web development is something that anyone can get started with. All you have to do is just have a browser. Like, you can get started just with Chrome and your laptop. You don't need any special software. And number two is that every company needs to have a website, right? Not everyone needs to have a mobile app, but every company needs to have a website. So if you learn web development and you learn how to build websites, it's a skill that you can apply across basically all domains. So that's also why our coding bootcamp focuses on web development as a skill. And if you learn web development, learning something else like mobile development comes super easy. Because there'll only be maybe a 10% difference in terms of what you'll need to know to basically go from web development to mobile development. And that's basically what I mentioned here, right? Is that it's easy to get started with. You see feedback right away, and it's fun. And that's why I also recommend that if you have kids or young children that you want to teach them how to code, probably the best way to do it is to have them start building websites, because they can see the feedback right away. And it's a lot funner than learning like mobile development if you're a complete beginner. Okay, so having said that, like even within web development, it's a huge field. So there are several areas that you could go down. You could go down the route of focusing on the front end, which is basically how the website looks. You could focus on the back end, which is where the data is stored. What is the logic or the brain of the application? All of that. You could go down the route of storage, of DevOps, which is basically how do you store data on a server? How do you do things like backup? How do you take care of things like security? All of that stuff. So each of the fields that are in web development could be their own career path. And that's also like one of the things that we try to teach in our coding bootcamp is we show you that even though all of these things are tied together, you might find that you gravitate towards one of these fields, and it's such a wide topic that any of those could be their own career path. So for example, there are certain people that took our coding bootcamp in the past that now work on the front end side, and basically they spend most of their time designing websites. Other people, they care more about how the application works and like the backend part. So like the logic of the application. So like how do users log in? How is data stored? All of that stuff. So some people, like their brain works more in that area, so they focus more on that. Other people, they're more like a generalist, so they focus on what's called the full stack. So the whole application, from the front end to the back end and everything else. So, I mean, my point is that this field is a very wide field, and there are a lot of opportunities, and there are like dozens of job titles that exist just from learning this skill of web development if you specialize. Okay, so one of the other difficulties of learning how to code, like I said, is it's not easy. So there are a lot of tools that can help you like basically build faster. So like one of the examples that I like to give is if you build out a website or an app and you're doing it with coding, it's kind of like building a house, right? So if you build a house, you could start from scratch, where you're basically building it completely on your own. And you can basically build it in whatever shape and whatever design that you want to have it built in. Or you could build it on top of some kind of a template or some kind of a structure. In that case, you're a bit limited in what you can do, but it's much faster. So oftentimes, what you're building matters. So if I'm building just a simple blog, right, I don't have to code it from scratch, because a blog is something that's been done thousands of times before. It's not a new topic, right? I can go on a website like Squarespace or like WordPress and just start a blog in 5 seconds, right? Same thing with the e-commerce site. So if I wanted to start an e-commerce site, I can go on a website like Shopify or like WordPress or any of those sites and basically get started. And I can have an e-commerce site in only 5 minutes. But the problem of doing it that way is that if you want to start building something custom, it's a lot harder. So like, let's say that you wanted to build an app like, Uber, but for cat sitting, right? Or like some like random idea that you might come across. It's a lot harder to do it off of some template. It's still possible, but it won't be exactly like you want. But if you learn how to code, it basically gives you kind of like a superpower where you can basically do whatever comes to your mind. So if you wanted to build like a complicated Bitcoin, I don't know, like a Bitcoin application that helps you, I don't know, like keep track of your finances, like that's possible if you do it on your own. But if you use some kind of a template, you can only do what's been done before. So you're a lot more limited in what's possible. However, there are still companies that start off using one way, then they shift to doing it from scratch. So one famous example of this is, if you know Careem, the famous app where you can book a ride. And like now, of course, they have things like you can order food. So Careem, they started off by just letting people have a simple form. So they started off with a simple template. And then once someone booked a ride, they would manually book the ride for them. So they started off in a very simple way. Then once they validated their product, then they moved to code it from scratch and basically built out their own application. So like my point is that you could get started now on your own, but if you want to actually know how to build something on your own from scratch, you should learn how to code. And nowadays, there's a term that's been thrown around a lot that's called no code. So no code basically means it's a way for you to connect things together without having to actually learn how to code. So I could connect a front end with a back end and basically build my own application on my own, even if I don't know how to code. Now, that's also really good if you want to test out something, but it also has some limitations in that not everything is possible, number one. Number two, they don't give you access to all of your data, so it's not really fully customized. So if you want to go and like change something small, or there's something that you don't like in how the no-code tool builds it, it's not possible. Also, even if you want to go down the route of learning how to use like some of these no-code tools, it helps you a lot if you know the fundamentals of how coding works, because all of these no-code tools, they still use things like databases. They still use things like front ends. They still have to have some way of transferring data from the back end to the front end. And all of that stuff, you would learn it if you learn how to code first. So I recommend that, and like this is what I did and a lot of other people do, is they learn how to code so that like that way they have strong fundamentals. Then if they want to use a off-the-shelf solution, for example, like a no-code tool, it becomes a lot easier for them. And it's not really like a crutch. It's more just something that can support them and help them by like making it easier for them to basically build whatever they want to build. So if you use these no-code tools properly, they can save you a lot of time, but it's still good to learn how to do everything from scratch on your own, because then you'll have, you know, full power to basically do whatever comes to your mind. So yeah, I mean, like I said, building it from scratch is harder, but if you learn it this way, you can build whatever you want in the future. So the main thing that you should take away from today is that there's not only one way to build a application, and there are several languages that can let you build either websites or mobile apps, and all of them are fairly similar. There's not really much of a difference. The only main difference is that some ways of building, you'll have to learn multiple languages. So let me explain that with a few examples. So like, let's say that I wanted to build a web application like a Facebook or like a Twitter. So how do I have to do that? I have to basically build out each of the components that are needed to have this actually become a functioning site. So what that means is I have to build out, first of all, my front end, which is how the website looks. Then I have to build out my whole like backend system, which is what is the logic of the application. And then I have to connect it to some kind of a database, which is where my data gets stored. So one example is like, let's say that I want to build something like Facebook. There's a screen that people can see that like they can log in from. And that screen that they see is the front end. And the front end could be a website and it could be a mobile app. Now, if there's some kind of a form, if I just build the front end, that form is not going to work because that form has to do something. If I just build the front end part, it'll just like show me a form, but the form can't actually be filled. If I want that form to actually have some some form of functionality, then I have to build out my backend system. So the backend basically is the brain of the application. It's what basically makes it run. So if there's some kind of a form and like there's a login and people can log into it, that has to be connected to some kind of a backend. Then that backend can then store data. So it stores data in something known as a database. So like these layers of having front end, back end, and databases is known as the tech stack. So a tech stack basically means what are the languages or the technologies that you're using to have this layered approach of having a front end, having a back end, and then having some kind of a database. So there are different ways of building this thing. So I could use just JavaScript, and that's what we're mainly focusing on for our bootcamp, because if you use JavaScript, it's the only language in the world where I can only have one language on the front end and one language on the back end. All of the other ways of building it, I would have to basically learn 2 programming languages. So if I want to use something like PHP, I would have to do JavaScript on the front end. Then I would also have to learn PHP on the back end. So I would basically have to learn 2 languages. If I want to use something like Python and I want to build an app, it's the same thing. I would have to learn JavaScript on the front end, and I would have to learn Python on the back end. And the same thing with any other one like Ruby on Rails or Microsoft.NET. All of these, they are back-end solutions. So they let you basically build like the brain of the application. But on the front end, I still have to use JavaScript. And that's why if you're learning for the first time, it's much easier if you just learn one language, because then you can just learn JavaScript and that can be done across the whole application. I don't have to learn multiple languages. So, I mean, that's why I recommend JavaScript. And like there's a saying by Jeff Atwood, he's the founder of Stack Overflow. It's known as Atwood's Law. He says that any application that can be built in JavaScript will eventually be built in JavaScript. I mean, it's kind of a joke, but what he means is that like now JavaScript is picking up so much that it's basically the main language of most applications that are currently being like developed. And like I said, it's a full stack language. So I can build mobile apps, I can build web apps, I can build even data science models. I can build basically whatever I want if I just learn JavaScript. So yeah, so like what we cover mainly in our coding bootcamp is what's known as the Myrn Stack, which is a collection of 4 JavaScript libraries. So like this is a bit technical, but it's what we cover in the bootcamp, that there are, I mean, like 4 types of JavaScript that we cover. So one of them is on the front end, React. And then there are 2 in the back end, Nodejs and the Express. And then for the database, we use something called MongoDB as a JavaScript database. So basically, those 4 ways of writing JavaScript are all in the JavaScript language. So it can all be done if you just like know how JavaScript works. I can build out the full application. Yeah, let me just briefly go over like what like all 4 of these do. So the last layer is the database layer, and that's what the M stands for. It stands for MongoDB. So that's the language of how is data stored. So there are basically 2 kinds of ways of storing data. So one way is in a normal like structured table, and that's what you normally see if you use like an Excel file, where data is stored in rows and columns. The other way of doing it is what's known as the object model, which is basically things are stored as an object. So it looks a little different. It's similar to how a normal database is, but this is written using JavaScript. Now, if you're not sure what any of this means, we cover it in the program. But basically, this is a way to store data using JavaScript, where you don't have to store it in terms of like having rows and columns. It's stored in what's called a object. So it's stored in an easier way. And the benefit of doing it this way is it's slightly faster if you have a lot of data in your data set. The other technology that we'll cover is called Nodejs. So Nodejs is the back end of how you build a full stack application using JavaScript. So Nodejs is, it'll take place of either like PHP or Python or any other backend language, and it's written using JavaScript. So like Node.js came out in 2009, and it became popular around 2012. And since then, people realized that they don't like need to use languages like PHP anymore, because they could just learn JavaScript, and then they don't have to learn multiple languages. They just learn JavaScript, and then they can do the backend and the front end only using JavaScript. So it basically lets you create what's called a backend server, which is kind of like the brain of the application. So it's basically what handles like data that goes from the front end to the back end and the storage of data. So one example of this is if you're having someone log in, they go on the front end and they log in, then that data has to be like basically checked. So I mean, if they log in with their email and their password, that email and password has to then be checked with the database to make sure that they have the proper login, right? To like make sure that they have the right email and the right password. So all of that logic, or like the brain of the application, is what's done using Node.js. Now, after that, Express is like what takes care of the API. So the API basically is what forwards data back and forth from the front end to the back end. So if you have someone log in, that login data has to be transferred from the front end of the browser or the mobile app to the backend server. So Express is what's known as a routing language. It's what takes care of, I mean, it's also known as a middleware. It's what basically links the backend to the front end. So like that's another service that we'll be covering. And the final thing is React.js. So React is what's known as a front-end library. It's also built using JavaScript. So what's nice about React is that it functions in what's called a single page application environment. So like React was developed by Facebook. It's an open source software. Anyone can use it for free. What's nice about it is it basically mimics how a mobile app is on the desktop. So what that means is if you go on a website that uses React, it'll load very, very fast because it basically functions like a single page. So if someone goes on the page and they click on something, it'll load right away because all of that data is, it's already preloaded into the application, into the front end. And one of the other benefits of using React is that it's really easy to convert it into a mobile app. So if you're developing a website and then you want to convert it into a mobile app, it'll literally take like 5 minutes. I mean, like there's almost no difference in terms of the code that you have to change because all of it is written in the same language. And it's designed as if it's a mobile app. And also lets you do things like state management. So I can have things where, you know, if a user logs in, it'll store their data on the front end so they don't have to keep logging in. It can pass data across the application. So all of this is a bit technical if you're not, I mean, if you're new to programming, but in the bootcamp, we cover this step by step. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, at the moment as a front-end language, it's the most popular at the moment. So that's why we're using it in our bootcamp for that reason. Okay. Are there any questions so far before I continue? Does anyone have a question in the chat or on mic? Like, feel free to let me know if you have a question.
Hi, Emma. This is Faiza.
Hi, how are you,
Can you
Faiza?
hear me? Yeah, I'm
I
good.
can hear
Thank
you.
you. Yeah, good. Okay. See, okay, I am actually not interested, or I'm not really. Okay, I can do coding, but it's really difficult. It seems really difficult. I am into data science. Would it be, you know, an essential to go over there? Is it like the main step to reach there, or I can skip this step?
Yeah, so it depends on what you want to get to in data science. So if you want to become a data scientist or work in business intelligence or one of those fields, there are shortcut ways of doing it. I mean, you could learn, you know, things like, you know, Power BI, Google Data Studio. Then you could get into, yeah, like either learn JavaScript or learn Python or one of those languages. So it is possible. I mean, it depends mainly on, I mean, so like, what is the type of role that you're looking for? Is it like working as a data scientist or do you want to build something?
No, I don't want to build something. I do want to work as a data scientist. I have been, I have enrolled in through R, like the React, and through Python, and through BI also is like it's on my course, but they have actually, they are giving out a little on the coding as well. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure because because this time is only e-learning going on. So I didn't happen to get to speak to the instructors yet, but I do want to have this conversation as well there. But then
Okay.
will it be helpful if I want to become just a data scientist, not really, you know, making the applications or, you know, browsers or anything like that?
So like, what is your current experience like?
You can say it's just a beginner level.
Okay.
I have been working into banking
Okay.
for like maybe a few years, but I want to switch. I don't want, like, you know, I think this one has a better scope nowadays.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think it'll go far. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I found, I mean, like a mistake that people often make is when they want to get into a career, especially data science, is they start off with the hardest thing first, which is basically machine learning, right? Or, artificial intelligence. Like those topics are really advanced and they need math skills, and they take a long time to actually get good at those skills. If you're just starting off, I recommend, and like most of the roles that are hiring for data science, they don't want to hire someone that's a machine learning specialist. And and even if there was that kind of a role, they would want someone that has more experience. So if you're just getting into the field, what I recommend is start on a lower level, which is basically something like business intelligence, or become like a data analyst, right? One of those two fields, and then slowly work your way up from there. And if you want to get into either of those fields, you just have to know basic coding. You have to know how to use Excel, and like maybe connect data together. So like, one example is they might need you to use certain like data science tools, like maybe Power BI or Tableau or one of those tools. And like those software tools, they don't really need coding, or like, they don't need like hard data science, but they do need some knowledge of coding. So, whether that's through our coding bootcamp or just learning it on your own, I recommend that you know the basics of data and the basics of how data is passed between things, because that will help you quite a bit. And I personally don't like recommend that you like directly go into machine learning if you're completely new, because you'll be overwhelmed by it. Because machine learning is something that you'll learn maybe after like a couple of years of working in data science. And I think that you might be turned off by it if you start off with the hardest thing first. Okay, there's a couple of questions here. All right, thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
No worries. Yeah, so there's a couple of questions here. Can I get the video link? Yes. So like I said, if you want the video link, send an email to Majd. I'll put his email here in the box, and he'll send it to you after the course is done. What is the relation between Express and Node? So Node.js is basically, it's the thing that actually does the work of the application. It's like the brain part. So it's the part that actually does things like, how does it compile data? How is data checked? How is it? All of the logic of the application happens using Node. Express is mainly used just to transfer data back and forth. So the Express's main function is to transfer data from your front end to your back end. That's the main thing that it's used for. Would you be able to build your data sets without knowing Java? Yeah, of course. Like the simplest way to use data sets is just using Google Sheets, right? You could get started, like opening Google Sheets, which is free, or just using, like a simple CSV file using Excel, right? That's how people usually get started if they want to get into data science, is they just get really good at spreadsheets, Excel, Google Sheets. And then that data can then be imported into a tool like Power BI. And then you can make basic models and reports based on that. Okay, there's a question here. If you have absolutely no programming knowledge at all, would you recommend they start with the bootcamp? Yeah, so I do. So so like how I saw people take this path is that you could learn on your own, right? Of course, nowadays, everything is available for free online. However, instead of learning it in 2 months, it might take you 2 years. And I'm not joking, because it's really hard to learn how to program if you don't have someone that's a mentor and someone that's helping you out. And the reason is because there are so many things that could go wrong when you're learning how to code. Maybe like there's a small error in one of your files, or something is not installed properly. And if you follow something online, you might get stuck on that step, right? And it happened to me when I was learning how to code, is sometimes something that like someone could help me solve in 1 minute if he knew how to code, I was taking 1 week just to learn how to solve that small thing, right? So of course, if you're someone that's a self-learner, you could learn how to do it on your own. And that's what I personally did, is I learned how to do it on my own. But if there was a bootcamp like this back then when I was learning, I would have taken it just because I mean, I could learn it on my own, but taking this kind of bootcamp, it'll take you from learning it in like 2 years to learning it just in 2 months. And if time is something that you care about, then I would recommend doing it this way. Yeah, like that's my answer. So yeah, so the front end, yeah, it's basically what we talked about. I mean, I'm not gonna go over this again because I already covered it. Yeah, I mean, like these are some of the technologies that we'll cover in the bootcamp, like MongoDB, Node.js, React, Express, Webpack, Babel. So all of these are things that we'll cover in the program. We'll cover things like, you know, server side, so how to pass data between applications. We'll cover, you know, APIs, which is basically how to send data back and forth, how to connect with external services like Google Maps, all of that. So in the program, our main project is we basically teach you how to build a social media application. So you'll basically learn how to build a front end, learn how to build a back end, learn how to build a login functionality so someone can come and they can log in, learn how to store that data in the database, learn how to encrypt their password, learn how to hash their password, and then learn how to have special views only for that user. So basically, if someone logs in, it'll know who they are and it'll show them a special view only of their data. So if you take this bootcamp, there's basically nothing that you couldn't build. If you wanted to build something like Uber or Airbnb or any kind of web app that comes to your mind, if you take this bootcamp, anything is possible. So in the program also, we cover 2 ways of building things. One of them is building through what's called a monolith, and the other is building using microservices. So the main difference is that if you build in the way on the left, which is called the monolith way of building, you basically have all of your code just in one place. So the code for the front end and the code for the back end and the code for everything else will just be in one folder or in like one set of code. And that's a fine way of doing it. But if you want to have it also disconnected, so your backend code is separate and your front end code is separate, we'll also show you how to do that as well. And one of the benefits of doing it in the way of using microservices is that it's really easy for you to swap out things. So what I mean by that is if you build it in the way that we'll teach you in the program, which is using microservices, I can build my backend on its own. So I'll basically have like the brain of the application on its own. Then on the front end side, I can swap out different front ends. So I might start off with a web application that talks to my backend. Then I can add on top of it to also have a mobile app. And that mobile app can talk to the same backend service without having to have me build the whole thing from scratch again. So basically, we'll show you ways to build applications where you can have multiple versions and build out things like, I mean, web apps, mobile apps, and connect them all together. Yeah, so we'll cover databases, we'll cover all this. And I mean, all that you need in the program is just a laptop. So all of the technology that we'll cover in the program, you can do it with a simple laptop. And I mean, as long as your laptop is not more than like 5 years old, even if you have like a really old laptop, you should be able just to work normally because most of what we'll be doing is based in the browser. So even if you have a very old laptop or even if you have just like a Chromebook, it should be enough just to get started with because most of what we'll be doing is either in the terminal or it's on the browser. And that's one of the benefits of learning web development first is that you don't need a complicated machine to get started. All right, there's a question here from Tunji. Do you want to come on the mic? Hi.
Hi, Ahmed.
How are you?
Fine, thank you. Thank you very much. Just to read, you mentioned something about JavaScript. So
okay.
I just want to iterate with you. Are you advising that going forward, anybody who wants to code from 2020 going forward should stick to JavaScript and probably not pay too much attention to languages like PHP?
Well, if you're building applications, yes. If you're building from scratch, then yes. So if you're building on like a blank slate, like you're starting from zero, you're building something from scratch, I would probably recommend to use JavaScript. However, sometimes you're building in some kind of an environment where there's already something built before, or you might have certain knowledge. So like, let's say, I mean, I don't know your background, but if you have experience with some other language like PHP, then it might be easier for you just to get started with PHP, right? But if you're someone that's brand new and you're building on a blank slate, I do recommend to start with JavaScript first, mainly because, like I said, it's the most like versatile language, and it can build basically whatever comes to your mind.
Okay, thank you.
No worries. Any other questions? Yeah, so the recording, yes, it'll be made available to you. As I mentioned, if your name is not on our meetup list, send an email to Majd. His email, I'm putting it in the chat now. Yeah, so the bootcamp itself, I'll come to that after just one more slide. So yeah, so also in terms of mobile apps, because I mean, that's probably also one of the most common questions people have is, you know, what if I want to build a mobile app? So in the, like, if you take this bootcamp, by the end of it, you could build a mobile app. It's not a focus of the program, but with your knowledge, it'll be really easy for you. So there are basically a few ways that you could learn to build a mobile app. So the first way is the normal way of doing it, which is using just native languages like you know, Swift or Java. That's the hard way of doing it. If you want to learn those languages, you could do it on your own. However, if you only know JavaScript, I could build a mobile app by using React Native, which is, it's a form of React. So if you take the bootcamp, it'll be really easy for you to actually build a mobile app. And there'll be only like a 5 or like a 10% difference in terms of your code. You could also use what's known as a wrapper. And a wrapper, basically, it can take your own website and basically wrap it into a mobile app. And there are services that can do this for you. One example is WebView Gold, and there's a bunch of other ones. And it's not that expensive. So I can basically convert a web app into a mobile app by only paying like a couple of hundred dirhams. So it's not really as complicated as people think it is. And I still recommend that people start with web development first because it gives you the most opportunity. Another thing is that if you look at trends nowadays, most people don't actually download as many mobile apps as they used to. Now, most people mainly go to, they go to websites on their phone. So there's a way to basically take your website and convert it where it'll look like a mobile app. And like, this is something that's known as a progressive web application. And what this is that if I build a web application, I can basically have it where it will look like a mobile app. So it'll mimic the behavior of a mobile app. What that means is if someone goes to it, they can add it onto their home screen, onto their phone. So it opens like a normal app. It'll also let them send them push notifications, and it can work offline, and it'll be full screen. So it'll basically look like an app. If you see it on their phone, you'll think it's an app, but it's not really an app because they didn't have to download it from the App Store. They just get it when they go to the website. And like, this is known as a progressive web application. So all of that can be done. And like, those are the different ways that you could build a mobile app. And like I said, if you take the bootcamp, it'll be super easy. So the bootcamp itself, there's a link for it that I'll share with you on the chat. If you just Google, AstroLabs Coding Bootcamp, you'll find it. And everyone here can also get 500 dirhams off if you just use the promo code here. Just type code MEET and you'll get 500 off. If anyone has any questions, like I said, so Majd is in the chat here. And I'll answer, I mean, let me stick around to answer any questions people have, then we'll go for the day. Okay, let me start with Sulaiman. He said that he has a question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes, go for it.
Yeah, so my question is, for example, if I start creating JavaScript and probably I want my program to be running on iOS, that is, I have to run it in Swift code, right? So
No, yeah, so like I said, in the end of the day, there are basically 3 ways to get your app on the App Store, right? So the first way, like you said, is to build it using Swift. I mean, that's the hardest way because you have to learn Swift. But the other 2 ways, like React Native and wrappers, both of those ways can actually be done using JavaScript. Then it converts it into the file format that you can upload to the App Store. So it doesn't have to actually be Swift code, no.
yeah. My question on this is that sometimes when you're building an app, I've heard before, I don't know if it's true, that if you build an app and you want it to be to perform highly, for example, to use the features on the phone, let's say the camera, or let's say the scanners or the sensors, and if you're using, for example, a wrappers or converting from one language to the other language, it may reduce the performance. Is that true?
That used to be true more about 4 years ago, but recently it's actually less of a problem. The only time where you're right is if you want to use some functionality that's not possible on the web. So one example of this is all phones nowadays have something known as a gyroscope. So a gyroscope basically is something that detects if the phone is moving, right? And that's not possible with using wrappers or a hybrid application. But anything like a push notification, like the camera, uploading files, all of that, I mean, even things like fingerprints, even things like if you want to use, you know, Google Pay, Apple Pay, all of that is possible. The only thing that's a bit harder is if it's like a game or something where you want to use like maybe if the user like does something on the phone itself, then it's a bit harder. But otherwise, almost everything is possible.
All right, thank you. I have another question I'm asking. You talk about the MongoDB databases that uses objects instead of the ordinary SQL, which uses tables, right?
Yeah.
My question, if for example, I want to make a command, an SQL command that specifies to produce a specific entity of data, can I do that with the MongoDBs?
Of course. I mean, anything is possible that you could do with SQL. Like the only difference is how you would write it and how you would structure it. So like one of the benefits though is it's slightly faster because of how it pulls records in. So like, let's say that I wanted to pull in a user's first name, right? And only their first name. If I was doing that with a normal old-fashioned SQL table, it would have to pull in the whole row. So if that row has a lot of data, it would have to pull in all of that data. If I use MongoDB, I could just say, just give me just this user's first name. It'll just pull in just their first name. So it's a bit faster in that regard. But in terms of what's possible, everything is possible.
Thank you.
No worries, anytime. Okay, let's go back to the chat, see if there's any other questions. Yeah, Tamara's asking, React Native is a hybrid. Yeah, so what that means, so a hybrid basically means that you're building it in some other language, like in this case, it's in JavaScript. Then when you compile it, it converts it into the forms that you can upload onto the App Store. So it's known as a hybrid because you only have to build it one time, and then it exports into versions that can be uploaded onto the iOS or the Android store. And yeah, it has all of the same functionality. It's like 90% the same functionality, unless it's certain kinds of applications where it's a bit harder. Like if it's like some kind of a game where you want to track if the phone moves, then I have to use native if I want to do that properly. Yeah, Sheila here saying, is PWA the future since apps are taking up so much space? Yeah, so it's not really that they're taking up more space. It's mainly that people don't want to go through the process of downloading so many apps. So there was a study done by Google last year where they found that the average person only used about 6 apps per day. And it's mainly just, you know, maybe Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, WhatsApp, Gmail, YouTube, right? There's maybe 6 apps that people use on a daily basis. I mean, if I look on my phone, there's probably 20 apps that I use maybe once in my life, right? And the thing is, most people, I mean, especially if it's a small company, they don't really care about the app, honestly, right? So having a PWA is a bit better because they don't have to go on the App Store and download the app. You can just basically load it onto their phone, and you have all of the same benefits that you would normally have if it's an app that they do download. Yeah, so the question is, how many number of hours do you recommend a novice person put into learning? So I recommend I mean, it's not really a number of hours, it's being consistent. So if you want to learn, I mean, keep in mind that if you want to be proficient at coding, it's going to take you at least 2 or 3 months. And you have to basically practice at least 1 hour a day. So if you want to actually get good, and that's what I noticed as a trend is you need to practice for at least an hour a day for at least 2 months minimum, if you want to become really good at it and actually be able to build out a full stack application. Let's see. Okay, any other questions before we go for the day? Anyone has a question that I didn't cover or wants to know about their own website or their own learning project or anything else? Now is your chance to ask. Yeah, so what about low code? Yeah, so like I said earlier, I mean, low code is similar to no code in that it lets you do things quickly, right? So if you wanted to like connect 2 things together, I can use something like Zapier, or I can use, you know, Airtable or one of those services. But the issue is that you still have to kind of know how to connect things together. And oftentimes if you don't know how to code, if you just get into no code directly, it could be a bit of a crutch because, I mean, you would learn how to do things very fast, but you wouldn't always have like the fundamentals of how to connect things together. How does a database work? How is data stored? How do users log in? How does the API work? How is data sent between applications? All of that stuff. So yeah. I mean, so it's a bit harder, but it is possible, definitely. Yeah, so there's a few questions here. I have a startup. Do you recommend me to hire or code it myself? So that depends on how much money do you have, how much time do you have, right? And how much are you willing to learn, right? If you don't have much money, or like you don't want to invest, you know, 30,000 dirhams or even more on like building something that's very fleshed out, you could, you know, do it on your own. But if you have funding and you want to basically build it fast, then I would hire someone. So it's more of a question of, you know, I mean, your personal like preferences, right? Is it something that you personally want to do? Is it something that you have time to learn how to do? So is it something that you want to launch in like maybe 3 months? Or if it's something that you want to launch now or in a couple of weeks and you have money for it, then you might want to hire someone. So it depends on what you want. Yeah, so there's a question here. What do you consider the advantage of React over Angular? So Angular, it used to be the most popular front-end framework until around 2016 or so. And the reason is because they introduced Angular 2 and developers didn't like it as much. And then React came out. So, I mean, like the short answer is that both of them are very similar. You could accomplish the same thing in both languages, but React at the moment is better, mainly because it's a lot more, like more popular. So there's a survey that's done once a year where they survey around, I think, 20,000 or so developers. and they asked them like, what is their favorite language to use using JavaScript. It's called the State of JS Survey. And last time the survey was done, React had triple the amount of interest among developers than Angular did. So at the moment, like the main answer is that it's a more popular language with developers. Why that's the case? A lot of it has to do with its functionality. So like I said, it uses, I mean, it basically mimics how a mobile app is. So what that means is it uses things known as components. And just like, I mean, like the design patterns that it uses is a lot cleaner, according to a lot of developers, than Angular is. So, I mean, there's not a huge difference, but I personally like React better just of how it's designed. And at the moment, developers like it more. So, I mean, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like more people like it, and then more developers use it, more companies want to hire for it, and it goes on like that. All right, everyone, thank you very much. I hope you benefited. And like I said, if anyone has a question, feel free to send Mej an email. There's his email there. Okay, I guess there's one final question here. Coding is one thing and being creative is something else. How would you suggest to adapt the thought process and business logic? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would probably, so what I recommend personally is try to work on your own project or work for a company, because if you work on a real life project, either like your own personal project as a business, or if you work for an actual business, it'll help you see things from a business point of view and like a logic point of view. If you just think about just building something in a vacuum, then you won't benefit as much than if it's either your own real life project or someone else's project as a business. All right, everyone, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. We'll be in touch, yeah? Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Have a good one.
Thanks a lot.
Take care.
You too.